Bob Lanzi, are you from Teaneck originally?
No, but my son is. Not originally, but currently living there.
Okay, because I knew a Bob Lanzi whose father was the gabbai or something in a shul in Teaneck.
No, not Lancy.
Okay, where are you from?
Edison.
Uh-huh.
Who's
Okay,
speaking?
Norman Eisenberg.
Norm Eisenberg?
Yeah.
Okay. And you grew up in Teaneck or
No, I was a youth leader in the synagogue in Teaneck, and this
oh,
guy Bob Lanzi's father, I think, was the chazan there.
no, it
Uh,
couldn't be. That I would know. There are not many Lancys, so it's not my family. That's first I've heard of that.
Okay, I met him at YU seminar 100 years ago.
That's me. I'm Bob Lancy. I'm not from Teaneck. I was living in Paramus then.
Paramus, I'm sorry, Paramus.
That's me. My
Uh-huh.
father was the principal there.
Okay. So I knew you from YU seminar.
Yes, the name sounded familiar to me.
And you're in Boca now?
No, my friend Shmuel Leitman is. I'm dialing in for that. Shmuel is lives in Edison during the summer, and that's where I live.
Okay. And I know him from Century Village in Boca. We're in Israel now.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah. Paramus was 100 years ago. I remember there was a girl named, we called her, let's see, Chicken, I think her name was.
Yeah, yes. It's, unfortunately she was Nifter.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about. And mine blanks out. But you probably
And,
remember Larry Lerman.
and I stayed at some relative of yours in London once upon a
That's
time.
very possible. I have a whole bunch of family there. Maybe my aunt,
Uh-huh.
Bella, Leo. Huh?
In 1971, I went to
Uh,
Europe and I stayed
oh,
there.
I
I
can't
lo-
Hi, Smalley.
remember. Hi, how you doing, everybody? Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'll wait for a few minutes for people to sit down.
Hello, Shmuley.
I know that. Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Shmuel Leitman. I'm going to be speaking about Yom Tov Sheini shel, the second day of Yom Tov that we all enjoy so much, especially when it's a 3 day. Before starting, I want to emphasize that I am not asking for anyone. Please confer with your own moral halacha from the question. I used quite a few resources in researching the Shir, but especially want to thank Rabbi Yaakov Ruben, who shared his detailed research on Yom Tov Sheini, which was published in the prestigious Or Mizrach periodical, which I leveraged quite a bit. The story of Yom Tov Sheni starts with how the Jewish people managed the calendar. As you all know, the Jewish calendar is lunar-based, as opposed to the Gregorian calendar we use on a daily basis and more familiar with, which is solar-based. In truth, the Jewish calendar is also partially controlled by the solar calendar, which accounts for the leap years. That's a story for a different speech. The Jewish month starts with the reappearance of the new moon, in particular when the moon first reappears over Yisrael. The moment it appears is called the Molech, the birth, which is announced in shuls all over the world when we do Berachas HaChodesh on the Shabbat before the Rosh Hashanah. Briefly, what happens is the moon revolves around the earth. When the moon is between the earth and the sun, it can't be seen and seems to disappear, as all of the reflected light from the back of the sun is not seen on the earth. When the moon is on the other side of the earth, then all of the reflected light by the moon can be seen, and that's called the full moon. Starting from when first seen, the new moon moment, the moon waxes, seems to grow larger as more reflected sunlight can be seen until it reaches the full moon. Then it wanes, seems to shrink until it disappears from view. This revolution around the Earth takes approximately 29 and a half days. Since a day cannot be split between 2 months, you can imagine that, half a day here, half a day there. Jewish months vary between 29 and 30 days. In other words, Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of the next month, falls out either 30 or 31 days following the previous Rosh Chodesh. So how do we know for any particular month if Rosh Chodesh is on the 30th or the 31st day? In Shmos, Barak, Days 12, plus Days 2, Hashem tells Moshe and Aaron, HaChodesh hazeh lachem. This month is for you. The Gemara in Rosh Hashanah 22a explains the word lachem, the word for you, is not needed. It's there to teach us that it's the Jewish court's responsibility to set the date for each month, and thus the Jewish people are given control of the Jewish calendar. In fact, the bracha we make in Musaf for Rosh Chodesh is Kadesh Yisrael B'Rosh Chadashim. Paraphrasing, Hashem blesses the Jewish people to establish the beginning. Similarly, for Yom Tovim, within the Shachar Shmona Esrei, the bracha for this specific holy day ends with Kadesh Yisrael B'Hasmanim. Hashem sanctifies Israel, who sanctifies the time calendar. Hashem put control of the calendar into Elohim. In the time of the Beis HaMikdash, witnesses who saw the initial appearance of the new moon traveled to Jerusalem to testify before the Sanhedrin, the great central court, that they saw the appearance of the new moon. The judges would then question the witnesses to make sure they really saw the new moon. They asked, was the new moon in the north? Was it in the south? Which way was the arc of the moon facing? And other questions to determine the accuracy of the testimony. If the testimony was accepted, the day became Rosh Chodesh, the first day of the month. If no witnesses came on the 30th day after the previous month, then the next day automatically became. In fact, astronomical calculations were well known to the judges, and they used that knowledge to determine if the testimony was correct or not. They knew if the new moon was going to appear in the north or the south, how high in the sky it would appear, which direction the arc of the moon would face, and other details, and were therefore able to check the witnesses' testimony. Despite the knowledge of when and where the moon would appear, the halacha required witnesses to see the new moon and offer the testimony before it could be formally established as Rosh Chodesh by the Sanhedrin. As an aside, if you're interested, these astronomical calculations are thoroughly detailed by the Rambam in Hilchos Pirush HaChodesh. It's all straight arithmetic, but very detailed with multiple dependent formulas. Recently went through that with a guru that I have on the Rambam, and oh my God, it's painstaking detail. Having the witnesses testify to seeing the new moon was so important that the witnesses were allowed, even instructed, to travel on Shabbat to Yerushalayim to be able to testify. The ruling of the court as to the date of Rosh Chodesh was final. Mishnayos in Rosh Hashanah, Parak Beis 2, Mishnayos 8 and 9, record that once the Beis Din headed by Rabbi Gamliel accepted a controversial testimony from two witnesses for the month of Tishrei, that's Rosh Hashanah. Rabbi Yoshua vigorously disagreed and held the witnesses were not acceptable. Thus, Rosh Chodesh and Rosh Hashanah would fall on the next day. Rabbi Gamliel then ordered Rabbi Yoshua to travel to him with his money bin on what Rabbi Yoshua would have considered to be Yom Kippur. Rabbi Yoshua complied, accepting the court's ruling in Rosh Chodesh. The Sanhedrin's ruling, even when in error, could be followed. Because the Jewish month could be either 29 or 30 days long, and because the Jewish holy days are specified the dates in the month, Pesach and Sukkot, for example, are on the 15th of the month, knowing when the month started is critical to observing the Yom Tov. This worked well for people living in and around Jerusalem as they became immediately aware of the declaration of Rosh Chodesh. People who live further away in Israel, or even in more further distant lands outside of Israel, had to be informed when the Sanhedrin declared Rosh Chodesh. Remember, there was no internet, no telephone, no TV. But what did they do to get the word out in a timely manner? The Mishnayos of Rosh Hashanah describe how this happened. When Rosh Chodesh was declared, fires were lit and torches were waved signals on high mountaintops, specific high mountains. People on other mountaintops saw the fires, and they lit fires to signal even more distance. In this way, the information quickly passed to all Jewish communities. This worked well for some time until the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah phase explains the Samaritans, referred to in that Mishnah as Pugarians, began to light their own fires on the mountaintop on the wrong days to intentionally mislead and confuse the Jewish communities about the correct time of Rosh Chodesh. To counter this deception, according to Yerushalmi, of Yehuda HaNasi, around 200 Common Era, abolished use of fire signals and instead sent out messengers to announce Rosh Chodesh to the various communities. However, the messengers had to walk, or at best riding animals, to the further communities, which often took more than 15 days. Thus, many communities outside of Israel did not know if Rosh Chodesh was on the 30th or the 31st day, and therefore were unsure when Yom Tov would start. Because of this, communities that the messages could not reach within the 2 weeks had to celebrate 2 days for Yom Tov. Thus, the introduction of Yom Tov Sheini shel. Because of the suffix, uncertainty of what day Rosh Chodesh actually fell. Again, 30th or 31st. Please note that although there were people throughout the Jewish settlements who knew exactly how to calculate the new year, they still had to wait to hear what day the Sanhedrin declared to be Rosh Chodesh. Still had to hold 2 days of Yom Tov outside the land of Israel. Why? Because declaring the day of Rosh Chodesh was solely the Sanhedrin's responsibility. Even if they knew the month should start on the 30th of a particular month, if no accepted witnesses came to testify, if it was cloudy, overcast, simply no one saw the emergence of the new moon. With no witnesses, the month has to start the next day. So it was mandatory to hear the date from the central Jewish court. The system of sending messages continued throughout the time of the Gemara until the days of Rabbi and Rabbi, somewhere around the year 300. When a fixed calendar, which was previously created by Noah, some say 300 years earlier, was implemented. You may ask, okay, now that we have a fixed calendar, do we still need 2 days? An old question. The Gemara, Mesa, 4b, asked the exact question. With a fixed calendar, why do we still need Yom Tov, Sheini, and Galut? The Gemara answers, the Chachamim mandated we continue having a second day of Yom Tov in case any foreign government forbids the use of the Jewish calendar, prohibits Torah learning, or limits it, ultimately leading to the loss of the fixed calendar. As I'll detail later, the Chachamim were not worried about this happening in Eretz Israel, even when ruled by a foreign government. The concern of not being allowed to use Jewish calendars sounds far-fetched, right? Well, the Soviet government did exactly that. During the reign of Stalin, the Soviet government introduced the use of the new calendar to try to prevent the use of the Jewish calendar as part of an overall crackdown on Jewish practice. The Gemara, Beta 4b, ruled we celebrate Yom Tov Sheini shel, even though we have a fixed calendar, and it is well known by astrological calculations in the image of the hero of Jerusalem, knowing for certain what day Rosh Chodesh is. Rashi's explanation of the Gemara is Rav Zera holds that we still hold 2 days, no longer because of the suffix, not knowing as originally instituted, but from now on it is a folk, a binding fixed decree made by the Chachamim to always have 2 days of Yom Tov outside of Israel. Abai agrees we hold 2 days, but holds it's not a folk, but rather an established minhag, tradition, which we must continue to follow. The Ran on Sukkah and Ridva on Rosh Hashanah paskin that it was an established takana, folk, while the Tosfos on Sukkah and the Rambam in Hilchos Yom Tov say it was a minhag. Interestingly, the Rambam in Hilchos Kiddush HaChodesh, Parak Hamishi 5 or Halacha 5, says, Avol takanos chachamim hi yezhiru b'minhag avosenu sheb'yitah. It is a takana, rabbinic rule, which we must be careful to follow as the minhag of our fathers that in our hands. I guess the Rambam is hedging his bet, saying it's a folk rather than a minhag. For most practical purposes, there's not much of a difference to us, whether it's a minhag or a folk, as any minhag established by Chazal and accepted by Klal Israel pretty much carries the same status of Kapana, and we must follow. Rav Hai Gaon, who lived between 939 and 1038, in Sefer Otar HaGoanim and Masechtas Yom Tov says something even more interesting. I quote, "There is no doubt that initially Hashem commanded his servant Moshe that in the land of Israel Yom Tov will be one day, and that outside of the land 2 days. And so it was always that in the land it would be one day, and outside the land 2 days. And our master Rav Sadia Gaon said in his responses to the men of Tabas that this is a decree from the early days of the Nevi'im. And those early Nevi'im who led Israel from the beginning of the first exile, and that they observed Yom Tovim outside of Israel for 2 days, and Yom Kippur 1 day." Rav Hai Gaon continues and states in his own view, Yom Tov Sheini outside of Eretz Yisrael began in the days of the very first Nevi'im, perhaps even in the day of Yehoshua. That's video. The Netziv agrees with Rav Hai Gaon, and he brings a seemingly superfluous pasuk in Vayikra 22:35, paragraph 22, pasuk 31, as a proof. So in today's world, even if we disregard Rav Hai Gaon and the fifth position that Yom Tov Sheini Sagolis was always and will always be great halachas from Hashem, do we know more than they did at the time that the Chana was established? Nope. Any additional information the Rambam did not have? Nope. The calendar was already fixed. The calculations were verified to be accurate. In fact, the Rambam's calculations were verified and used by Sir Isaac Newton almost 500 years later, who proposed changes to the Julian calendar based off of the accuracy of the Rambam formulas and calculations. Nevertheless, the rabbinic ruling the lands outside of Israel have to continue to celebrate 2 days. So until the Mashiach comes and Sanhedrin is back in place, we will continue to celebrate 2 days of Yom Tov and Putzah, while Israel only 1 day of Yom Tov. Sorry, I wanted to different. There is considerable discussion among the poskim as to the exact locations that are encompassed by this Tafana. A full discussion of this topic is well beyond this of the Mashiach. But in a nutshell, the Ritva's opinion, Rosh Hashanah, 18a, is that the Takana draws a distinction between communities located in Israel and outside of the country. According to the Ritva, a single day of Yom Tov is observed everywhere in Israel, while every community outside of Israel must observe 2 days of Yom Tov. Even a community that might have observed only 1 day of Yom Tov during the era of the Beis Hamikdash and the Gemara, due to its proximity to Yerushalayim. The Rambam, on the other hand, maintains that the Quran stipulates that 1 day of Yom Tov should be observed in any place where a single day was observed during the era of the Beis Hamikdash, while 2 days should be observed in any location that the messengers sent by the Sanhedrin could not reach in time, the locations where Yom Tov Sheini were originally. Furthermore, in areas that were uninhabited in the time of the Hamikdash, but are inhabited today, such as the Bnei Brak and the Galut, the Rambam actually rules that 2 days of Yom Tov must be observed. Practically speaking, we follow the rule. And today, a single day of Yom Tov is observed in any location that's part of Israel, while 2 days are observed everywhere outside of Israel. So what do Israelis visiting Chutz La'aretz over Yom Tov do? And similarly, what do those who live in Chutz La'aretz visiting Eretz Yisrael? Starting with Israelis visiting Chutz La'aretz for Yom Tov. The Gemara and Mishnayos have plenty of discussions about what to do when visiting places that have differing minhagim. As a plug, last year I gave a shiur on Ashkenazi versus Sfardi minhagim. If you're interested, it's on the shul's website. Okay, and the Zachem Perak Arba 4 starts by describing some locations that have the minhag to work on, not to work, while other locations allowed working. If one traveled between the two towns, the Mishnah rules that a person must always take the chumrah, the stringency, from the place he came from or the place he went to. According to the Ran, this refers to a person who plans on returning to his hometown. For example, if his hometown did not allow work in the Pesach, but the town he traveled to did allow, he could not work. Similarly, he could not work even if his town allowed working, but the town he traveled to did not. The Mishnah adds that this rule must be followed to avoid machloket, arguments, to avoid questions like, how are you working today in Erev Pesach? Are you more important than those of us who can't work? Rabbi clarifies we're not concerned with machloket in the opposite case. A person who doesn't work and visiting a place where work is allowed, that person doesn't have to work, as the local population would just assume he has no work, vacation, I don't know, retirement, something like that. The halacha following the summers was taken very seriously. The Gemara in Pesachim 51b tells the story of Rav Nasai, who lived in Israel, who traveled to Pudisa on the second day of Shmuel. He was excommunicated by Rav Yosef for violating the second day of Yom Tov, despite him having traveled from Israel where he was no longer Yom Tov. Backtracking a bit, the Gemara in Pesachim 51a tells the story of Rabbi Bar Barfana, who traveled from Israel to Bavel. He was at home privately eating a particular fat that was allowed to be eaten in Israel, but according to the accepted minhag in Bavel was not. When Rav Avira and Rav Huna came to visit him, Rabbi Bar Barfana he quickly hid the fat that he was eating. Rav Ashi explained that even though Rabbi Bar Barfana was in Bavel where the food was not allowed, since he planned on returning to Israel, he was allowed to eat it in private. Once his Babylonian visitors came, he had to quickly put it away so they would not see him eating food which was not allowed in Babylonian. The Gemara in 51b also tells the story of Rav Safra, who according to Tosfos lived in the town that messengers did reach in time, meaning they always held one day of Yom Tov. He asked, saying, now that the calendar was established, if he travels to an area that holds 2 days of Yom Tov. He said he knows if he's in the town itself, he has to hold 2 days. But what about if he's in the desert or an uninhabited area? Does he have to follow the 2 days there? Rabbi Abba responded that in populated areas, he must follow 2 days. He is not allowed to do any work on the second day. But he would be permitted to do malachot work if he's in the desert and uninhabited area on the second day. From both of these Gemaras, we learn that an Israeli in Chutz La'aretz has to follow the second day for any public. But if he's in private, or residing in a completely non-Jewish area, he can. Rishonim actually disagree as to whether he must observe the stringencies in private as well. Rashi implies that work is only prohibited in public, where others can see. Tosfot explain that work is prohibited in private as well. The Taz on Shulchan Aruch Siman 596, Halacha 2, follows the opinion of Rashi. However, the Mishnah Berurah, Siman 568, Halacha 17, and Magen Avraham there, rule like Tosfot that even if in private, Halacha is to be prohibited for an Israeli on the second day of Yom Tov, if residing in a Jewish neighborhood, since it will ultimately be found out that he did do it. Even stricter, the Shulchan Aruch Harav, followed by most Chabad Hasidim, says Israelis in Chutz La'aretz need to follow Yom Tov Sheini, since in his opinion, it was created to add Kedusha that's lacking outside of the Eretz Yisrael. According to this ruling, an Israeli who visits Chutz La'aretz should refrain from doing any melacha on Yom Tov Sheini in order to avoid deviating from the normal local rule. He should even dress in Yom Tov clothing, according to Tzayyadah. However, he should pray silently the weekday prayers and later going in private. Even those who are stringent, like Tosfos, permit one to form malachot that an observer would or could assume are permitted. For example, when Yom Tov falls out on a Thursday, a visitor from Eretz Yisrael may cook on Friday without having made an Erev Shul, as the observer would assume he prepared an Erev Shul. Similarly, one may move a klish in Lachel Iser, which is Mukta, as an observer may assume he's moving it for a commended purpose. Rav Moshe Feinstein suggested that as many set the lights on Shabbos. One may shower on Yom Sheni, even in a manner prohibited on Yom Tov, as the observer will assume he showered in permissible. The halachas are there a little complicated. Now the flip side, someone from Chutz traveling to Israel for Yom Tov. Strangely, the Gemara does not address this case at all. It's clear that in the times of Beis Hamikdash, a person visiting Eretz Yisrael from abroad would celebrate only one day of Yom Tov and bring his korban, sacrifice on that day. However, following the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, it is possible that the Tana mentioned above would require a visitor to Eretz Yisrael to continue observing 2 days of Yom Tov in order to maintain the stringency of the minhag of his place of origin. The Shulchan Aruch also does not discuss what a resident of Chutz La'aretz who is in Israel on the second day of Yom Tov. However, in Shelas Utshuvos Avkat Rachel of Yosef Cairo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, rules that a visitor to Israel is obligated to observe the second day of Yom Tov. The Avkat Rachel adds, quote, "It has been widely accepted custom since the days of old and practiced by the great scholars of the world. They would gather together many congregants from the diaspora and recite the Yom Tov service." The Beis Yosef's view is disputed by the Chacham Tzvi in Shilas Yeshuvos Chacham Tzvi, who maintains that a visitor to Israel should observe only one day of Yom Tov, and that keeping a second day is a violation of the prohibition of Tosef, the prohibition to add to mitzvahs of the Torah. The Chacham Tzvi explains that the requirement to observe Yom Tov Sheini applies only outside of Israel, where the concern exists that a foreign government might prevent the Jews from using the calendar, and thereby recreate the spectacle of confusion. In Eretz Yisrael, though, this concern does not apply. The Chacham Tzvi adds a general rule that a person must keep stringencies from the place of origin does not apply in this case, since the observance of Yom Tov Sheni is not a minhag of a person, but a function of one's location, a makom goer. The physical location is the determining factor in the Chacham Tzvi's word. I'll explain this in more detail shortly. However, the Chacham Tzvi's own son, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, disagrees with this thought in response to Shelot Yair. In the Sefer Yer HaKodesh V'Hamikdash, Rabbi Yechiel Nefel Tukashinsky quotes the view of his grandfather, Rabbi Shmuel Salan, who essentially agreed with the Chacham Tzvi, but deferred to the rulings of his mentors and peers, advising that in practice one should adhere to the stringencies of both opinions. More on this later. This dispute has been discussed at length by many great scholars, Mishnah Brura, Aruch HaShulchan, Igros Moshe, along with many other contemporary poskim, all except the ruling of the Avkat. Because this dispute is so divergent, let's spend a bit of time to try to understand the different opinions of the Avkat, the Rachel, and the Chacham Tzvi. As we have seen, the dispute between the Avkat, Rachel, and Chacham Tzvi centers on the question of whether the law of the traveler is bound by the stringencies of the place of origin applies to the observance of the second day of Yom Tov. While the Avkat Rachel maintains the law does apply, the Chacham Tzvi's view appears to be that travelers are not inherently linked to the place itself. In cases where the customs are not caused by the location, it's simply stringencies that happen to be observed by people of that location. For instance, as I discussed in the Gemara before, Psachim 51a, in Chutz La'aretz, it was customary to refrain from eating the fat from a certain part of an animal's stomach. But in Israel, that stringency was not involved, it was observed. This is an example of a stringency not based on location. Simply happens to be observed in Chutz La'aretz and not in Israel. It's a custom of the people of Chutz La'aretz, not a stringency inherent to that place. This type of stringency must be observed by a member of the community that practices it, even when he's in a different location, as long as he intends to return. Thus, it will be forbidden for a resident of Chutz La'aretz to eat that aforementioned fat from an animal's stomach, even when in Israel, since he's a member of the community. In contrast, there are other cases where it's not appropriate. The traveler to be required to observe the stringency of the pledges of office. For instance, according to the view that the laws of Truma and Misa are applicable today as rabbinical requirements, it's obvious that a resident of Israel who visits Chutzpah is not obligated to separate Truma and Misa from the fruits of Chutzpah, even though that's his custom to do it in Israel. This is because the laws of Truma and Misa are subject to that concept of Hamokim Galut. The requirement to separate tithes is linked to one's location, since only the fruits of Eretz Yisrael are subject to these laws due to the holiness of the land. Consequently, not logical for anyone to be required to separate Truma and Misa from the fruits of the Based on this distinction of types of customs, we can explain the Chacham Tzvi and Beis Yosef in Al Tashlachal disagree regarding how to classify the custom or folk of observing the second day of Yom Tov. According to the Chacham Tzvi, it's considered a custom related to location, and therefore does not apply to a resident of the The Al Tashlachal, meanwhile, maintains it should be considered a custom of the people of Chutzpah, not a stringency associated with the place. Not used to someone talking. To support the position of the Askat Rachel, one might argue the concept of Hamokim Gorim applies to the laws of Yom Tov Sheini only at the time when the new moon was sanctified based on the testimony of witness. At that time, Yom Tov was observed for 2 days out of doubt, since the messengers of Basin could not reach the clerics in time to inform them of the date of Rosh Chodesh. Hence, the geography really was needed to establish the custom. Today, though, we are well aware of when Yom Tov could be observed, and when Yom Tov Sheini is observed solely on the basis of the Chachamim imposed under the aspect to keep the customs of our fathers. This takana may be considered a stringency of the people of Chutzpah rather than one link to the land itself. In fact, the very argument is addressed by the Chacham Tzvi himself. The Chacham Tzvi explains the reasoning Jews of diaspora required to keep the customs of forefathers was, as previously mentioned, that the sages were concerned the hostile government might pass laws preventing the Jews from being able to use the calendar. Since this is not likely to occur in Israel, the Chacham Tzvi maintains that even the later ordinance perpetuating the observance of Yom Tov Sheini is considered a Hamokim Galut. Halacha is determined by the great geographic. Why does the Chacham Tzvi maintain a potential disruption of the calendar not considered in Israel? This may be based on a statement of the Meiri in Besa 5a, that we are never concerned that the Torah will be forgotten in Eretz Yisrael. Indeed, the very fact that a second day of Yom Tov was never instituted in Israel implies there never was a concern that Torah or calendar would be forgotten, despite the interference of hostile leading forces. Therefore, according to the Chacham Tzvi, the concept of Hamokim Gorim applies to the observance of Yom Tov Sheini even today. Clearly, the Beis Yosef disagrees with the Chacham Tzvi. He maintains that there is indeed a concern that the use of the calendar may be disrupted in Israel as well. Hence, the observance of Yom Tov Sheini is not determined purely by the geographic location. But if so, why wasn't the time of Yom Tov Sheini imposed also in Eretz Yisrael? The answer must be that the Tana was instituted only in Chutzpah where there was a pre-existing minhag. Again, the custom of our forefathers to observe 2 days of Yom Tov. In the Chutzpah, the sages decreed that the existing custom should be continued due to concern that the calendar might be disrupted. This aligns with the previously reported Rambam, who said it's a chok, follow the minhag, connecting the two. In Israel, though, where there was no pre-existing minhag to observe 2 days of Yom Tov, the sages did not wish to create a new custom. That explanation is not mine. It appears in the commentaries of the Raj, the Safta Sukkah, 44a. He states the basis of the kind of Yom Tov Sheini is rooted in concern that the use of the calendar may be disrupted, but the sages would not have imposed the takana if not for the existing. Okay. Thus, the Beis Yosef concludes that the difference in custom between Israel and diaspora regarding Yom Tov Sheini is a function of communal practice, not geographic location. and a traveler from Chutz La'aretz is indeed obligated to observe the stringency of keeping Yom Tov Sheni even in Israel. I didn't see this anywhere, but another challenge in the Chacham Tzvi could be Yom Tov Sheni was celebrated in Eretz Yisrael on Rosh Hashanah. We're celebrating one day only in and near the base of Mikdash itself. Since it was Rosh Hashanah, witnesses may came late, may have come late in the afternoon, there was no way to get the word out. So for most of the people living in Israel, the day of Rosh Hashanah actually fell, the day Rosh Hashanah actually fell out, was a suffix as well, and was observed for 2 days. As you all know, everyone in Israel still do that today. They all celebrate 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, despite the fixed calendar. Thus, in my opinion, undermines the Chacham Tzvi's opinion that the minhag is based on Hamakam Lorem, as it did and continues to exist in Israel. Nigras Moshe, that's Rav Moshe Feinstein, holds like the base Yosef, and maintains that residents of Chutz La'aretz who visit Israel is prohibited to perform malacha on the second day of Yom Tov and is required to keep all the mitzvahs of Yom Tov, just as he would in Chutz La'aretz. However, he has a slightly different reason for requiring the second day of Yom Tov. Rav Moshe reiterates the second day of Yom Tov was originally instituted as a Safek, and later instituted to the Jews of Chutz La'aretz due to the concern of the lack of the loss of the calendar, the potential loss of the Jewish calendar. As a result, a resident of Chutz La'aretz must be accustomed to always observe 2 days of Yom Tov in case such a disruption takes place. Therefore, even when a Jew from Chutz La'aretz visits Israel, he must observe Yom Tov Sheni simply so that he will remain accustomed to doing so when he returns to Chutz La'aretz. Okay.
But a yeshiva student only.
We'll get to that. Well, we'll get to that. We'll get to that. Hold your horses. I'll have questions at the end. Just exactly. Okay. So far, we have the opinion of Beis Yosef that someone from Chutz La'aretz visiting Israel must celebrate the second Yom Tov. This opinion is followed by almost all poskim, including the Sidon, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, Darei Tshuva, Mishnah Brura, Chazon Ish, Moshe Feinstein, Minchas Yitzchak, Rabbi Yoshev, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Rabbi Zion Abba Shaul, Chaim Pinchas Scheinberg, and Rabbi Leitman. On the other hand, the Chacham Tzvi holds that Israel does not celebrate Yom Tov. Interestingly, the Shulchan Aruch Harav, which is earlier, written by Rav Shneur Zalman, the first Lubavitch Rabbi, follows the Chacham Tzvi. Thus, many Lubavitch from Chutz La'aretz will celebrate only 1 day long. The Shulchan Aruch Harav does mention that others disagree with this. There's also a middle edition by Rav Shmuel Salant, which I referred to earlier. This approach attempts to balance the opinions of both Rav Cairo and the Chacham Tzvi. The view essentially agrees with the Chacham Tzvi that theoretically only 1 day observance should be all that's necessary, but to play it safe requires one to be strict like Rav Cairo. This is known in common usage as observing a day and a half. The opinion requires one to not to perform any, prevents one from performing any malacha or eating chametz on the 8th day of Pesach, yet dictates that one should say the weekday prayers and put on film in private. This is also purported to be the view of Yosef Soloveitchik, ordered in Yerushimat Shiurim. And as a further footnote in the back of that sefer, that says by Rav Moshe Meiselman, that said that Rav Aaron Lichtenstein also concurred that that's what Rav Soloveitchik did. He held that compromise position. Please note that the term day and a half is a very misleading term. I know several people who believe that literally was a day and a half, only celebrating Yom Tov Sheni until noon. That's not what it means. What it means is exactly what I described. No malachot, following all of the halachas of Yom Tov Sheni, of the Yom Tov, but wearing a house and filling the 5,000 rupees. It's interesting to note that Rav Chaim Elazar Shapiro of Munkach refused to stay in Israel for Shavuot. He was unsure of what position to do. Why should have a stricter halachic status than other Yom Tov Sheni. Since Shavuot falls out 50 days after Pesach, in the days of the Gemara, messengers were always able to get there on time before Shavuot started. And there was never any doubt as to what the correct day should have been. Yet Chazal decreed that Yom Tov Sheni be kept anyway to keep Shavuot in line with the other Chagim. Therefore, in the case of Shavuot, Yom Tov Sheni was always based on the Takana and never on the sake of the Yom. Okay, so what do we do? Some authorities have opined that bachelors who come to Eretz Yisrael to learn, study Torah, should observe only one day of Yom. Rav Chaim Mordechai Galut and Shari Tshuva, Rav Chaim Rabbi Halevi and Rav Chaim Sholem. The presumption there is that young men will be offered appropriate matches and will stay in the group. Rav Moshe Feinstein, however, in his response to Moshe and Or Chaim, maintains that a yeshiva student, though financially dependent on his parents in his diaspora, who could presumably tell him to return home to his diaspora, is still regarded as a chutzpah student and must keep to them. People who go to Israel with the intention of shortly making Aliyah are generally instructed to hold 1 day. Note, if they make Aliyah, hope to stay, but not sure it's going to work out, Rabbi Yashav says to hold 1 day, but Rabbi Moshe Feinstein and Rabbi Vadia Yosef say he must hold 2 days until he's sure that the Aliyah will work. There are various opinions regarding people who own property in both Israel and Chutz La'aretz. Those that always visit Eretz Yisrael for Shlosh Regalim, those Israelis who always go to Chutz La'aretz for Yom Tovim, you fit into those categories. Ask him more Allah. For my final discussions, I mentioned Rabbi Yosef Cairo said that it was an ancient minhag for people from Chutz La'aretz to celebrate Yom Tov Sheni with Israel and to have separate minyanim for the holiday prayer. Having previously quoted Mishnah saying we can't go against the minhag of Makom to avoid conflict, how could people have separate public minyanim to daven Yom Tov prayers and Yom Tov Sheni, where the minhag is to daven weekday prayers? Rabbi Yosef Cairo answered the sages of the land of Israel regarded davening prayer as not as threatening in any conflict at all, and hence didn't say anything when diasporic Jews had their own opinion. Rav Shlomo Zalman responds, since the second day of Yom Tov Minyanim existed for hundreds of years, it created a new custom that now coexists with it. So it's okay to follow. This opinion can also be used against the opinion of Chacham Tzvi, saying the custom now does exist for hundreds of years for people in Chutz La'aretz to hold Yom Tov Sheni. The bottom line, the people visiting Eretz Yisrael, the overwhelming number of poskim hold one should fully celebrate second day Yom Tov Sheni. There are some who hold a day and a half option, and fewer, primarily Rabbi, who do not celebrate Yom Tov Sheni following the Shulchan Aruch and the Chacham Tzvi. Personally, I follow the majority of the Gedolei Torah, Moshe Feinstein from Moldam and Harba, or Yosha, Beis Yosef, Mishnah Berurah, Emden, and many others, and hold 2 days and Yisrael. But if you're in doubt as to what to do, find and ask from a reliable posting. Thank you for listening. Any questions?
We'll find a rabbi that says it's okay not to observe the second day. But the problem I had originally in Israel for 18 years was that the rulings are not the Araisa you were born of. And I had a problem, trying to figure out, I thought they all come from the Torah and it's interpreted by the Rabbanim.
The Rabbanim do have the authority. We actually mentioned this before the Shira. They do have the authority as far as the Raisa. For example, if Rosh Hashanah falls out on the Shabbos, do we blow the shofar?
No.
Why? The Raisa, you have to blow the shofar. Rabbanim are allowed to do that. Rabbanim have the power to do that. In Sukkot, the first day of Yom Tov falls on Shabbos. Do we take the rule of an Esrog? Why? It's also a Daraisa. That's the only day that's a Daraisa to take the rule of an Esrog. And yet we don't. The Rabbanim have the power to do it.
Almost half of the year, more than half, I'm sitting there. and we flew back on the last day of summer. And the plane was loaded with from Jews, all of them very obviously observant. As soon as we got to the airport, the people came off, the caps went on, the sisters went inside. But for them, they felt it wasn't justice anymore. They might go to visit relatives, at which point they would observe respectfully the minhagim or the dinim of that family. But they didn't have a problem at all flying to the state on the 8th day.
You know,
Correct. I mean, again, especially if you're leaving from Eretz Yisrael, it kind of goes against that Gemara that I quoted before him, where the Rav was put into Sherem because he did travel to Pumbedisa over the second day of Yom Tov.
as an aside,
Yeah, well,
when I used to visit, when I used to come back to visit my children, and I came down here for a yontif, the people sought me out to turn their light on because it didn't go on.
so you were in Shabbos time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know people do that. Is it halachically proper? People do that. Okay, thank you all.
Okay.